Hello everybody and welcome back to another RevWise video. Today I have an IGCSE double award paper 1 for you. So double and triple students, you have to do this. This is really important paper because it counts for majority of your marks for your science. So for both double and triple students, it's crucial that you do on this paper. This is especially important for those of you that have your mock exams in January, as you really need to start doing past papers now and start getting used to how to answer questions with the correct technique. So yeah, I'm going to be going through all these answers, all the way to structure your answers, and then I'm going to also link the mark scheme and the full paper in the description so you can attempt the questions for yourself. And yeah, let's just get right into it. So we have question 1. The diagram shows a forest food web. How many producers are shown in this food web? Well, let's have a look. For the producers, we know that the producers they're always plants, and they're at the bottom of the food web. They have no arrows connecting to them, right? Because the first arrow goes to the primary consumer, and the producers are the ones that start the food web. So let's have a look. Which one started? Well, we can clearly see grass has no arrows coming to it, so that's 1. Also red oak, there's nothing coming to the red oak, so we know it's a producer. And the cranberry bush is another producer. For the rest of these, like mouse and caterpillar, they have arrows coming to them, so they are primary consumers. So if there's 3, so the correct answer is B. How many secondary consumers are shown in this food web? Wait. So let's have a look. Secondary consumers, we know, is not the first arrow, but the second arrow. So it needs to go to the primary, and then the second arrow leads to the secondary consumers. So let's have a look. Well, we can see one little food chain here, and this is the best way to identify it. Break it up into smaller food chains, and then identify all the secondary consumers. So it goes from grass to mouse, which is the primary, to coyote. So that's 1 secondary. Then let's have another look. We can see grass to deer to coyote. That's the same one, so that's not another one, because it's asking how many secondary consumers are there. We don't want to add another one there. So we look at grass to deer to tick. That's 2. Let's check another one. Cranberry bush to caterpillar to blue jay. That's 3. Cranberry bush to caterpillar to waxwing, and that's 4. And that means that we have 4. We're not going to count the coyote as 2, because it's asking how many secondary consumers are shown in the food web. There's only 4. So the correct answer is C. The coyote uses some of its senses to catch the deer. Name the sense that uses receptor cells in the retina. Well, we know the retina is in the eye, and the receptor cells in the retina are responsible for sight or vision. Just use any sort of variation of the word, but make sure you're being clear in what you mean. So vision/sight. Next up, a coyote runs 530 meters in 30 seconds trying to catch a deer. Calculate the speed of the coyote in meters per second. So for this question, it's 2 marks, so we've got to make sure we're showing our working out. Equations aren't necessary for this, but I think it's nice to just help you guys understand. So this is a simple equation. We need to calculate the speed in meters per second, and we have the distance in meters and the time in seconds. So we need to do no conversions, and we need to do speed equals distance divided by time. Then we can do the simple calculation of 530 divided by 30, which equals to an answer that is around 17.67 meters per second. Now, one thing to note is that in the mark scheme, this will score you marks 17.67. Something else that will also score you marks is 17.6 recurring, because that's what you'll get on the calculator when you type. You can also get marks for 17.7, and you will also get marks for 18. So that's the thing. You'll get marks for quite a range of degrees of accuracy, but a nice thing that I like to do is always leave it to 2 decimal places. However, a lot of the time you'll see that it's rounded quite harshly in the first answer on the mark scheme. Don't be afraid of that. Just keep it to a suitable degree of accuracy that you're comfortable with. Now, the coyote will not catch the deer if too much lactic acid builds up in its muscles. Explain why lactic acid builds up in coyote's muscles when it runs. Now, this is 2 marks, so there's quite a few things we can say about this. But first of all, we gotta identify why does lactic acid build up. Well, lactic acid builds up due to anaerobic respiration being used to provide energy for running. This happens due to a lack of oxygen and requires no oxygen to be carried out. This answer will get us 3 checkpoints on the mark scheme, so we technically don't need to be this thorough, but it's only 2 sentences and it's really easy to remember. So just remember, when you hear lactic acid, one of the key words for the marking point is always going to be anaerobic respiration 90% of the time. It's really crucial that you mention anaerobic respiration. It's also pretty crucial that you need to say that it's providing energy. This is the thing people often forget. You have to say this, provide energy for running. This is 1 mark. This is also 1 mark, anaerobic respiration. And another mark is to state that it happens without oxygen being needed. Whereas where you're saying there's a lack of oxygen, essentially, right? And yeah, this is very thorough answer, and I'll get you 2 marks, and with some to be spared. So yeah, let's have the next question. Question 2. Organisms can be classified into groups based on their features. State 3 differences between eukaryotic and prokaryotic organisms. Now, this one might scare a few people because just the names eukaryotic and prokaryotic might seem to be a bit intimidating, but it's actually really simple. And you just have to remember the key differences. So, the one key difference is that eukaryotes have a nucleus, whereas prokaryotes have a nucleoid. At IGCSE, something to note is that often you aren't marked down if you only state 1/2. So if you just said this is spelled wrong. If you just state 1/2, whereas you say eukaryotes have nucleus, you're not actually explaining the difference. You're just saying that they have a nucleus. But you'll actually a lot of the time get marks for that because that's how the mark scheme works. But it's really, I'd say it's good advice to just give the full answer. Prokaryotes have a nucleoid, just so you're being more certain. I know that it might seem like a hassle if it's not necessary, but anything to get you to confirm you get the mark is really important, right? Another thing to mention is that you have to say no organelles that are unique to each of them, right? Now, you might know the definition of each, but you need to know at least 1 organelle, and this organelle is really important, and it's like one of the identifiers we use for a plasmid, for a prokaryote, which is a plasmid. Prokaryotes have plasmids, whereas eukaryotes don't. Another thing, which is essentially the main difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes, is eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles. This means they have organelles that have their own membrane. They have compartmentalization. You don't need to know that word, you don't need to even think about it, but it's just a nice thing to know. They're compartmentalized, in which they have different sections with their own pH values, with their own characteristics that are enclosed by membrane. So prokaryotes don't have this. They don't have membrane-bound organelles. So don't confuse yourself with that. Just remember this. It's just something to note if you decide to pursue biology and IB. It's a thing that you'll have to learn about, or A levels, whatever course you take. Now, these are 3, but there is more. So another thing you can say is, instead of saying eukaryotes have, I keep spelling this wrong actually. But if you don't want to say membrane-bound organelles because it seems more like hard to remember or it's too technical, you can say just 1 organelle that you know that eukaryotes have, that you know that prokaryotes won't have. So you can give an example of a membrane organelle. So eukaryotes have mitochondria or chloroplasts. These are two great examples of these organelles, and these will also get you marks. So yeah, this is quite an annoying question to get, especially is asking for 3. It really differentiates on who's has a good understanding of the syllabus, but I think it's not too bad to answer, so yeah. Let's see. Give an example of a disease caused by a proctoctist. Wow. This is quite the interesting question. Now, to be honest, I haven't seen many questions like this when I did my IGCSE revision myself, when I did my papers, and I did not get a question like this on my paper. However, that does not mean it won't show up. And it is important, these examples of diseases and proctoctists, right? They show that you have an understanding of what you're learning instead of just cramming the information, which is something that IGCSE tends to stray towards often. So it's important that you actually understand. Now for this, the mark scheme is always going to be quite general because there are a variety of proctoctists and a variety of diseases caused by proctoctists. So I'm going to give you an example, but if you guys have learned something different in school, feel free to use anything like that. So the example I'm going to give is the example of the amoeba that I remember the most easily, the proctoctist that I remember most easily, which is an amoeba. It's a nice name. I quite like the sound of it. And yeah, it's just easy for me to remember. And what it causes is something called dysentery. Now, if you guys feel like this is hard to remember, you may find it difficult. You should know amoeba is a proctoctist, so the name of proctoctist should be able to get a point easily. This disease is not going to appear very commonly. It's going to be quite rare, but it's always good to know. Amoeba causes dysentery as its disease. And another thing to note, mention, if you studied Plasmodium as your proctoctist, right? Another disease you can put is malaria. It's just another thing. And this question, I haven't seen much like it quite often, so don't stress about it if you're a bit scared. But this is only 2 words to remember, and it could help you get a mark. So just keep this in the back of your mind. Proctoctists such as amoeba and Plasmodium can cause diseases such as dysentery and malaria. All right, question 3. We have a nice 3 marker here with a cute little squirrel on my screen. Now, squirrels are animals that live in woodland. They feed on nuts produced by trees. The diagram shows a squirrel eating a nut. Describe a method you could use to show the nut contains fat. Oh, lovely. Okay, this question is pretty nice, and it's pretty easy question. So, first thing you're going to mention is that I believe at Edexcel we learned the cloudy emulsion test instead of the Sedan 3 test. If you learn the Sedan T3 test, I won't be going into that in the answer, but you should know how to respond to that if you did a Sedan 3 test. But for the cloudy emulsion test, the first step always, right, in these types of questions, is to look at what you're testing for fat. So here, we're testing a nut, and this is just a nut. It's not ground up, there's nothing done to it. So one thing we have to do is crush or grind the nut. Right? You can say with a mortar and pestle, you can say with whatever you want, but you do not need to state that. You just need to say crush, mash, grind the nut. Right? That's the first step. This is always really important. People often forget it because they go straight to talking about the answers. Right? Then the next thing is you need to talk in reference to the cloudy emulsion lipid test. Right? So in order for this, right, you need to mention 3 things in your response. Ethanol, adding water, and then finally you have to talk about the observation you find. And the observation is a cloudy emulsion forms in the solution. Right? So the thing about this question is that you have to structure your answer pretty well because it's in three parts, but you can get marks for just these are the marking points that you'll get marked on. But writing like this doesn't show the examiner that you have good understanding. It doesn't show that you actually understand the topic, right? So in order to actually show that you understand, you have to talk about how you add it. So you have to say that you add the grinded nut to ethanol, then dip in water, right? And then they will form a cloudy emulsion, right? This is not technical at all, right? But just writing a bit of sentences saying how you added it just makes it seem that you actually know what you're talking about. Yeah, you don't need to go really in depth. One thing to note is for these questions that ask you about testing for stuff like proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, they're often asking you for stating that you ground a nut or whatever you're grinding, whatever you're sampling. You have to talk about ethanol for lipids. You need to talk about water, and you need to talk about the observation, cloudy emulsion. Don't go overboard with your response because you see all these lines. You don't need all the lines to get your answer. And this is one thing. This line's tricky. You can get marks with just this, so just remember that. Went a bit longer for that question, but I feel like people quite often slip up on that. So, yeah. B. The table lists substances found in two types of nut, A and B. The mass of each substance is given in milligram per gram of nut. Nice. Explain the role of fiber in the squirrel's diet. So there's a table here as well. We will have a look at it when it's necessary for the question, but for now, we'll just answer question BI. So, well, we know what fiber does in the diet, right? Fiber is involved with peristalsis. It helps prevent constipation. It helps bowel movement, right? And it aids in digestion, right? But we can't say it helps digestion because that's quite a vague answer, right? It's pretty vague to say it aids in digestion. So we want to say something that involves peristalsis, because peristalsis is how the food moves around through the gut, right? Through the intestine. So we want to make an answer referring to peristalsis. And we also want to say how it aids in bowel movement, right? It prevents constipation, and moves food along the intestine. Now, when you construct your answer referring to this, you have to refer to these two, but there's some also things you can refer to. And the Marsh scheme, it refers to undigested material, such as cellulose. When you construct your answer, linking this to these two might be more difficult. And this is quite a harsh question, because fiber is not mentioned too much in your syllabus. You do have to know it, but it can make it a bit confusing. So if you're confused, just know that fiber aids in bowel movement. That's its role. It prevents constipation, and you know the process for that occurs through peristalsis, right? So mentioning aid in bowel movement and peristalsis is enough to get you the 2 marks. Mentioning the undigested material and cellulose can get you a bit confused, so I don't recommend it. Explain which nut is better at helping the squirrel make red blood cells. Alright, so this is substances found in 2 types of nut, A and B, and then the different substances, right? So we have to look at the substances and we have to identify which would help with red blood cells. Now, what does red blood cells have in them? They have hemoglobin, the pigment hemoglobin. It's what makes them red. Now, what is hemoglobin? Hemoglobin is a pigment in blood that is often closely related with iron, because iron is what makes it, right? So we need to look at the iron values and see which one has a higher iron value, and that is going to get you the mark. Now, one thing to note, protein will also get you the mark for this. So you can say either iron or protein, and one thing you'll see is the one that has higher iron also has higher protein. So it's gonna get you that. So just remember, for hemoglobin, it contains iron and it is a protein. So anything that has a higher in that regard will get you the mark. So I'll state that nut A has more iron slash protein, therefore one thing to note, this question is explain. If it was describe or something like that, stating how more iron means more red blood cells would get you enough for the mark. But since it's explained, you have to explain why iron and slash protein get it. It's because hemoglobin is necessary in the production of red blood cells, and hemoglobin contains iron, and hemoglobin is a protein. So that's why. Nut A has a mass of 28 grams. Calculate the total mass of carbohydrate in this unit. All right, let's have a look. So we have nut A has a mass of 28 grams. Calculate the total mass of carbohydrate in this unit. It's 28 grams, and this is in milligram. Okay, so we can see it's 167 milligrams. This is going to require a conversion, right? Because we know that it has a mass of 28 grams, and this is substance in milligram per gram of nut, right? So this is per gram. So if we times this value by nut A by the number of grams, we should get the total mass of carbohydrate. But we need the conversion here. So what is 167 milligrams in grams? Well, to calculate that, it's just going to be times 10 to the minus 3 because it has milli, 1,000. So it's going to be 167 divided by 1,000, which is 0.167. Then we times that by 28. And in the end, we get an answer that is 4.68. Like I said before with the rounding, 4.7 works as well. So just go with whatever you want. The graphs show the number of squirrels, foxes, and trees in woodland 2010 and 2018. Discuss the possible reasons why the number of squirrels from 2010 to 2018, the decrease in the number of squirrels from 2010 to 2018, and use information from the graphs and knowledge in your answer. Alright, 5 marks. And we got a first thing in these questions. A lot of times people lose marks because they just don't read the question. I mean, what does it ask you? It says use information from the graphs and use your own knowledge in the answer. So it's easy to just do it in the order that you see. So let's have a look. We have to use the information from the graph, and we have to see the patterns here. So let's look at the patterns for all of them, and let's get my drawing tool for this. The squirrels, you can see, it had a decrease, right? The foxes, on the other hand, had an increase. Yeah. The trees, that's constant. I mean, it's constant here, right? It's a bit less. Actually, yeah, it's a bit less, what we can see here. But the difference is slightly, very little. You can see it goes from 20, and here it's just around 20, right? So, what's easiest to mention? The foxes, because that's a much more considerable difference in the trees. So we're going to go with that first. Foxes increased from, we don't have to be exact with this, so let's just look at the value. It's around 3. From 3 per km squared to, that looks like around 7. This leads to a higher ratio of foxes to squirrels. This means there is increased predation. Thus, thus squirrels. Alright, so that's probably 1 mark, and I went pretty lengthy with just so you guys can understand what I was going, right? So, another thing to note is that there are fewer trees, regardless that it's negligible. There are fewer trees, so we can state that there are fewer trees in 2018. 22 to 20 to 19 per kilometer squared, right? There are fewer trees, and trees provide habitat and food for squirrels. That's why the population of squirrels decreased. Now, we've referred to the graph to the extent that we can. Foxes and trees are the only things mentioned. So now it really comes to your knowledge of theory. Why could the squirrels' population decrease? Well, I'm going to go through a rapid fire here because I don't want to spend too long on this because I'm sure you guys know how to answer this. Well, one of the reasons is that another external predator entered the woodland, interfering with the food web there. Yeah. Next up, disease within the squirrels. Alright. The season / time that the numbers were collected. If this was collected in winter 2018 and summer 2010, you would expect a decrease in some of the populations, like an alteration, right? There are different characteristics, other factors that play into it, like season, stuff like that. So yeah. Another thing that we can say is migration may have occurred. Human involvement. This can be through deforestation or hunting, whatever you want to say. Now, one more thing is that after you've mentioned as much as you can, if you wanted to be more technical with your description, right? A thing that I could have said at the start when describing the graph is talk about the difference between the different organisms in terms of their variation. So you can say that something like the fox's increase is much more significant than the tree's decrease, right? This demonstrates that you understand the graph. Foxes increase much more It may seem simple and unnecessary, but simple things like this can be what gets you the mark. So make sure you talk about the graph first, milk all you can from the contents of the graph. And after that, only after that, you talk about all your theory, get all that down. And the reason is sometimes the smart scheme restricts you on, you have to mention the graph, right? In this one, it doesn't. But you never know in the paper that you get. So it's always important that you talk about the graph when you're given a graph.